Welcome everyone to the Trentonian interview sessions. My name is Nick Peruffo. I'm here with Darren Freedom Green and Dr. Andra Gillespie, our guest today. Dr. Gillespie is the author of The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, Newark and Post-Racial America. Very glad to have you here, Dr. Gillespie. It's our honor. Before we really get started, my first question is, and you talked a little bit about this in your introduction, why did you choose to focus on Newark so specifically as one case example of this phenomenon?
Well, it all happened organically. I went to Newark in 2002 at the invitation of Cory Booker. It all started when I met him at a talk at Yale University in 2001 to study voter mobilization. And so I picked Newark as a site because it had a large African-American population, and I wanted to see what it would take to increase voter turnout in a majority black locale. So whether it was canvassing or mailing people postcards or calling them on the phone. And I happened to be there in 2002 when Cory Booker ran against Sharp James, the then 16-year incumbent mayor, and I saw these other things happening while I was there. So I saw, older black and younger black politicians vying for power, and then it really devolved into this discussion of who was black enough to lead the city of Newark. It was an interesting question. And I actually thought it was more interesting than my question of whether or not, canvassing increased voter turnout. So I finished that for my dissertation and then decided after I became a professor that I would focus on this specifically. There were other things that were happening in the United States at the time that suggested that this was actually a very fertile place to do research. So when Cory first ran for office in 2002, he wasn't the only young black gun challenging establishment black politicians for power. In 2002 and specifically, Denise Majette challenged Cynthia McKinney in Georgia, where I happen to live now. And then in Alabama, Earl Hilliard was defeated by Archer Davis, another young rising star, formerly of the Democratic Party. Now he's recently turned Republican. So it seemed like it was very interesting. And by the time I started to, really do this research in earnest, we all knew who Barack Obama was. So we knew that something was happening in African-American politics. And I was just really fortunate to have been at the ground level of that sea change and decided that I would run with it from a research perspective.
Explain your concept of the black political entrepreneur. This is really what the whole book is really based upon. You give a bunch of examples besides Cory Booker and Obama, but just explain more in depth what that term means.
So it all goes back to an edited volume that I published 2 years ago called Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Black Leadership. I really wanted to drive home the concept that in the cohort of young black politicians, those who are in their early to mid 40s up to their early 50s now at this point, are a very diverse group of people. And so when we think about the types of politicians like Cory Booker or Barack Obama, we shouldn't also neglect to know that there are other young black politicians who actually are very traditional in their approach and very racialized in how they pursue African American politics. So I wanted to be very diverse in sort of explaining the panoply of young black politics today. Specifically, when I look at black political entrepreneurs, they represent a particular type. It's the type that we think about. It's the type we think about when we talk about post-racialism. It's the type that we think about when we're thinking about President Obama. These are young black politicians who tend to de-emphasize race in terms of their personal appeal. They have a huge crossover appeal. They're able to reach out beyond the African-American community and win votes in those communities. They also don't have demonstrable ties to the black political establishment. So there is a sub-cohort of young black politicians who are the children of prominent activists or politicians. So you could think of somebody like Jesse Jackson Jr. or Harold Ford Jr. or Kendrick Meek. These are people who inherited their seats or were able to get their seats because they had a certain type of name. And so that's actually very different than Cory Booker or Barack Obama. Their path to power is actually a lot harder because they don't have these ties to traditional black political centers. And in many instances, they tend to be outsiders to the communities that they actually start to run for office in. So when they're running for office, they have to do things differently. They're going to encounter more resistance from the black political establishment than some of these other people who are juniors. And so my book focuses on the strategies that these gentlemen, and they are mostly men, take in order to get elected to office, and then it ponders what the consequences of those strategies are for future political coalition building and then also for governance later on.
You argue that the sort of aggressive tactic that these young black politicians take can often reinforce negative stereotypes about black politicians in general. They're trying to gain leverage over older establishment, black establishment politicians that, in many cases, frankly, have not been particularly successful in their communities. So that seems to me like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, I mean, I would never argue the strategy that young black politicians who are kind of coming in and being insurgent and don't have the ties to the establishment, I call it elite displacement. And elite displacement works. So I'm not going to tell anybody that if you don't employ the strategy that it doesn't have a chance of being successful. But I do want people to understand that every strategy has its advantages and its disadvantages. And so when we're thinking about communities of color, when we're thinking about urban communities, when we're thinking about inner city communities that often deal with a lot of structural and social challenges, where you're dealing with high unemployment, high HIV rates, high school dropout rates, and all these other kinds of things, these are communities that a lot of us would look at as failed communities. And so it's actually really easy to point at the leadership that's already there and say that they've done wrong. And in many instances, that's true. They do bear a lot of the responsibility for what goes on in these communities. But by focusing on that, particularly the tone by which one focuses on those types of things, you actually may potentially set yourself up to fail. And so it all of a sudden starts to look like you're saying something like, well, black people are not, capable of turning their communities around, if even the black political entrepreneur can't turn a community around. Or it ends up sort of reinforcing this idea that, these are just completely dysfunctional communities, and perhaps they need to be completely displaced. So whether they are fully gentrified or whether we just come up with other ways to, impose a type of carceral state on poor communities of color, we just need to think about normatively what that gets framed by. And we also need to ponder, especially for those of us who come from more affluent communities where we're not used to dealing with that level of pathology, we need to think about sort of, what we bring to the table and what types of stereotypes about poor people and people of color that we bring to bear when we're thinking about what type of leadership we want to impose on the communities, and whether or not these residents actually have a voice, and being able to articulate actually clearly and eloquently what they want and what their objections are to what to us looks like perfectly reasonable leadership.
And not only that, you also talk about how there's a danger of these young black political entrepreneurs stereotyping themselves as, I think you use the term, the magical black man, that can come in and just save the day with their Stanford education, and when the problems are probably more complex, and a more measured approach would probably be
I mean, I think that's actually unfair to the black political entrepreneur. I talked about this recently in the Root, Root.com. About Cory Booker, especially after he saved his neighbor in that house fire. So all of a sudden, Cory Booker can, gives people kidneys and can solve the North Korean nuclear crisis and is at Hillary Clinton's beck and call. And it was all done in good fun. But it sets Cory Booker up as somebody who is, larger than life. And that actually makes it very difficult for him to be approached. And it actually makes it very, very difficult for him to do his job, because if it turns out that he can't solve all the problems of Newark, or he can't solve them all during his term in office, then he gets judged as a failure. And that's not fair to him either.
Right. I was talking with Darren earlier before you came about Cory Booker's perception on the streets of Newark, and how there's a real disconnect there. Even more so in his second term, sort of like what we're seeing with President Obama. The sort of honeymoon period, if that's what you want to call it, is over. Darren, do you want to jump in? And
I think our discussion was based on, you can take it where you want to, Ross Baraka, and how you were saying in terms of coming in, educated, Cory Booker's everything on a national level that we would look for. But why is it one of his main adversaries is somebody who looks just like him and really has the attachment he needs, which is that grassroots orientation? Why does that always seem to happen when you have a black mayor and their biggest adversaries are those who look just like them on a grassroots level, who at some point, if they could incorporate them with them on the team, I think a lot of change could happen, because our problems are systemic.
Well, there are a couple of answers to that question. One, I think because we're so used to, at the national level, blacks appearing cohesive politically, we forget that there's always been contestation, and Black people have been arguing and debating what's the proper path for the betterment of African American communities as long as we've had something called Black politics. So, you know, we could go back to Du Bois versus Washington. We could go back to Dr. King versus those who were gradualists and see that these debates are always present.
Right.
You know, Cory Booker's cachet is huge nationally, and his style is perhaps, you know, better received on a national or even a statewide scale than it is locally, where it seems to be, and we need more empirical tests to actually prove this for sure, but it looks like Black voters at the local level prefer more racialized politics, which is where Ras Baraka gets his traction. Now, Ras has his own issues. Ras has a great grassroots base in the South Ward, and it seems like, you know, it may in fact be growing, but it's not. It's debatable whether or not he actually even has a citywide appeal. So, you know, Newark is half Black. It's about a third Latino, and then the rest is would be considered white. They're mainly Portuguese, and so it's divided into 3 wards. So 3 wards are considered historically a majority Black, and then you've got a majority Latino ward, and then you've got a majority Portuguese ward. Ras Baraka does very well in the South Ward that he represents, but he is not a viable candidate in the North or in the East wards. So in order for him to have a wide citywide appeal, he would have to change his persona, and that would go against his whole nationalist upbringing, and his father would probably take issue with him publicly for doing something along those lines. So they both have their own challenges, and, you know, they both have their own ambitions. So I think it remains to be seen whether or not Ras Baraka's program is something that can be translated outside of the South Ward.
Excellent.
What's sort of interesting to me is you talk about these young, and not to overly generalize, but these young Black political entrepreneurs like Cory Booker, and how they need to hedge towards the mainstream for a broader appeal. But to me, it seems that they're hedging towards the Democratic mainstream, and particularly President Barack Obama and his recent support for gay marriage. Historically, the Black community has not been receptive to gay marriage and other social issues like this, historically more religious. Do you think that's part of the divide that we're seeing?
Well, no. I mean, in this particular instance, at least as far as gay marriage is concerned, one of the things that happened is that Pew, I think it was Pew, released a poll the week after President Obama made his announcement in favor of gay marriage, and actually Black support for gay marriage jumped immediately afterwards. So it could be that President Obama is actually going to be a driving force behind changing African American public opinion. Now, there are still going to be very religious African Americans who are going to oppose gay marriage on religious grounds, and their support for Obama may diminish, but it's not going to diminish to the point that all of a sudden you are going to see sort of this rash of new Black Republicans. There may be some who choose to sit this particular election out because they feel really conflicted about the issue. But by and large, African Americans don't base their support for the Democratic Party based on social issues like gay marriage or abortion, though historically they've been more conservative on those issues than whites have been. When we're thinking about the Democratic Party, one of the things that we think about, because most African Americans are Democratic, when we're drawing these theories up, we're mainly talking about Democrats. We're not talking about how Black Republicans factor into this, and it's in part because it's just a small sector of the population. But when we think about sort of national Black Republicans, there are many who are prominent. I mean, we've had a Black chairman of the Republican National Committee. We have 2 Black members of Congress right now. There's a potential that there's going to be another Black member of Congress coming in the fall from Utah, of all places. So, you know, we as we start to see this phenomenon happen more, and as we start to see Blacks, you know, openly identifying as Republican, we'll revise our theories to try to be more inclusive of this kind of thing. But one of the things about young Black politicians, especially Black political entrepreneurs, it's really interesting. They're socially very progressive, which puts them in the mainstream of the Democratic Party, but then they're also neoliberal. And so this was kind of the conundrum that Cory Booker found himself in a few weeks ago when he made his comments in defense of Bain Capital on Meet the Press. This is somebody who has had very good relationships with Wall Street and has been able to use them for his own donations to his personal campaigns, but he's also been able to create public-private partnerships where he's had people who have made their money on Wall Street and made their money in investment capital invest in Newark and actually help to keep programs afloat and do things in the community. So he's got a much more positive spin on it, and he, like many people in his cohort, is actually very open to using market-based solutions to try to solve long-term social problems. And so, I'm actually very agnostic personally on the efficacy of these things, but I actually appreciate and respect the spirit in which this is being done. So Booker and many of those who are in that sort of neoliberal cohort have looked at sort of increased social spending and the safety net, and they haven't seen the results that they would have wanted to see. So you haven't seen a reduction in crime necessarily, or a reduction in high school dropout rates, or a narrowing of the achievement gap to the extent that we would have wanted to see it. So their approach is, well, let's see if these other solutions work. And so the question is, so you support these. If it turns out that this sort of neoliberal market-based solution doesn't work, then is this cohort actually willing to go try something else and to say, well, this didn't work as well? And so that remains to be seen, because we're still in the process of testing many of these new approaches, but it's the openness and the willingness to try new approaches that often distinguishes them from the Democratic establishment, and the Black Democratic establishment in particular, which sort of has its own, investment in old strategies, whether or not they've actually proven empirically to work or not.
Do you think there's a danger that Cory Booker can receives undue pressure from the connection to Obama? And it strikes me that a white Democratic mayor of Newark who understandably, like the comments about Bain Capital, would not have received the criticism that Cory Booker did. Do you think that connection hurts Cory Booker in that way?
Well, so there were a number of things that kind of related to that. I think we can look at what happened with Bill Clinton this past week, where he made similar comments. At first, it looked like he was going to be able to get away with it because he was a former president, but even he's been forced to have to backtrack on his comments and apologize. So he's been forced to stay on message, which is amazing because Bill Clinton is famous for doing what he wants to do. So I would say that that's not necessarily the case. And when the Bain Capital critique came out, there was an ad that was released that included not just Cory Booker, it included Harold Ford as well, but it also included Stephen Ratner. So, there have been whites who have made some of these comments. Ed Rendell has made very similar comments, and it seems as though people latched on to Cory Booker's comments in part because of, I guess, the tone in which he made them, because he was very emphatic in how he did it. And then also because he was African American, and because, maybe implicitly the Republican National Committee jumped on the fact that there were Black Democrats who were criticizing President Obama openly, and that was something that they could capitalize on. I mean, I think at the end of the day, part of the reason why there was such a backlash to Booker's comments was because he immediately ended up on the Republican National Committee's website as a fundraising tool, and that was, that was a big problem.
Right. Darren, you want to add anything?
I wanted your approach on something I took into effect that I'm dealing with here as well. In a lot of these cities, small urban development cities, the political paradigm shift in terms of the young Black politician coming in is often hindered by the elder politician who's in place, and there's no development, there's no teaching, there's no no nurturing of, like for instance, a Sharp James, even though if he wasn't removed, he'd have ran forever. But there's no handing of the baton to the young and upcoming individual, and that creates a void and almost a disconnect between two different populations, and you often end up losing the whole war that's going on. What's your take on why other politicians don't reach back and nurture young and upcoming politicians and prepare them for the seat they can't sit in forever?
Right. So, I mean, there are lots of
you can go any direction you want.
The first answer is, I think ultimately at the end of the day, people need to realize it's not about their position and their power. It's about serving the community.
Right.
And at the end of the day, the generational fight actually ends up doing a disservice to the people that you're supposed to represent. And so if you keep the people first, then that should help guide what you're supposed to do. I actually had this conversation with State Senator Ronald Rice.
Okay.
And so he's in a very interesting position. He ran against Cory Booker in 2006. He was definitely part of the old guard. His son ran with Cory Booker and is the West Ward councilman in the city of Newark. And so father and son have often run against each other. In 2006, Senator Rice actually endorsed his son's opponent in that ward council race.
Wow.
And so it's, a very, interesting development. When I asked him about mentoring, he said it wasn't about mentoring. He said when the young people came to us, their attitude was, well, okay, we got out of college, now it's time for us to take over. And they actually saw it as an affront. In many instances, what I think is that the older people think that they are actually mentoring younger people. It's just that they think that their mentorship track has a much longer arc than the younger people do. And the younger people kind of had a lot of vim and vigor, and they wanted to take over sooner than their parents actually thought was appropriate for them. And so it's a question of, well, you know, where's the middle ground in this, and sort of, you know, what are the arguments on both sides of it? So I think the older black politicians actually, you know, wanted to hold office perhaps a little bit longer than they should have, and they should have had a succession plan in place earlier, and they should have been mentoring people earlier. And then the younger people probably in some instances could have benefited from more seasonings or additional job training. So not just graduating from college and graduating from professional school, but perhaps, you know, doing a stint working.
Okay.
You know, in the private sector or working in politics before actually running for office. A lot of young black politicians start their political careers in their late 20s and early 30s. And given the amount of time that we stay in school nowadays, you know, that means that you have actually very little, you know, workaday experience before you start running for political office. And perhaps it is advisable for people, you know, to spend some time in the trenches working in, you know, your chosen profession and establishing yourself as an adult before you actually start to run for office. So they may have a point with that, but the idea that somebody like a Cory Booker or a Ron Rice should be waiting to run for office until their mid-40s because that's going to make their parents in their 60s and 70s, you know, amenable to what's going on.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the older people are going to have to concede that that probably is a little unreasonable. The irony of it is that sort of in the wake of the results of the 10th Congressional District race, where Ron Rice Jr. ran against Donald Payne Jr. to fill the unexpired term and then to ultimately succeed the late Congressman Donald Payne. So we see another heir taking over. So Donald Payne is taking over. That's going to leave a void on Newark City Council. And one of the leading contenders to replace Donald Payne Jr. on Newark's municipal council is John James, Sharp James's son. So, yeah, so now Sharp James does have sort of, you know, a mentee in his son, and so he can kind of see what's going to happen with that going forward.
So it has a lot of dynamics to it. Another question I had was, and this is kind of in the book as well, why when you come to most, again, urban cities, and you have historically long-standing black mayors, predominantly black councils, but the population of those cities, and specifically black communities, suffered immeasurably from failing school systems to, again, the recidivism going over and over and over again, to the failing of the programs which would help to develop the community, to, again, what I get back to, and Joey and I were talking before we started, the failure of our families. You know, a lot of those areas, but a lot of the people who are sitting in the seats should be going to bat again for the same people who elected them. And those are the ones who seem to be suffering the most. But just what's your take on that?
So, and part of it has to do with style and familiarity. So, when we think about sort of crumbling cities, I can tell you as an academic that part of the reason why it looks like urban mayors historically have presided over chaos is that they actually took over during a time of, you know, rapid change. So they're taking over during deindustrialization. They started taking over in the 70s and 80s, where we're having a period of economic stagnation in the United States, and actually a retrenchment on federal aid to cities. And so that left them with far fewer resources than they intended to be able to, you know, try to make cities better. So they didn't have the resources that they would have liked to have had. And then they couldn't figure out sort of what plan B was. So the plan B eventually became, we'll give some contracts to, you know, some minority businesses, we'll increase affirmative action, and we'll do some things to address police brutality, because that was often sort of a refrain of what actually helped propel some of the first black mayors in major cities to power. So, you know, Newark, we could look at Detroit. There are lots of places where this was definitely an issue. So beyond that, it doesn't look like that generation of black mayors was actually equipped to deal with the complexities of a changed political environment, a changed economic environment, and just the structural problems that were facing their cities. So younger black people come in and they say, well, we have better education, so we can do this better. And then it's a question of whether or not they're actually savvy politically to be able to navigate in the mainstream environment, to understand that there are people who are just resistant to actually providing help for those types of communities. And sometimes they actually share the same party that you do, so you can't just blame it on, oh, well, it's Republicans who never want to spend on cities. Yeah, no, they're Democrats who don't believe in this either. And so that has to be acknowledged. But the one thing that the older black politicians did was that they made connections with people in their communities, and they developed a type of personal loyalty that is very difficult for Black political entrepreneurs to cultivate. It's difficult for them to cultivate because, one, they don't use the same style, because remember, they don't emphasize race all the time, so they're not actually appealing to racial solidarity, so people don't give it to them.
Right.
And then there's also this challenge of not necessarily being from the community and being sort of a known commodity. And if it looks like you have any type of progressive political ambitions, then people will feel exploited. And especially if you've been in a community, you know, there are lots of things that, you know, people may or may not know in poor communities. But poor people usually know when they're getting had or when they feel exploited. And so they may interpret ambition as a sign of exploitation. And so therefore they're going to be resistant to that. So, I mean, whether it's right or wrong, you know, is not for me to judge. It's just for me to note that that's kind of what's going. And so they look at somebody like a Cory Booker who clearly has progressive political ambitions, and they think this is just another person who's coming here to bide his time, and I don't necessarily know if I'm going to benefit from that. And I don't feel the same type of connection because he doesn't make the same type of overtures to me that Sharp James did, and so therefore I'm going to be very, very mistrustful of that. And so young Black politicians have to be very savvy of this and recognize that they're not going to get the same type of loyalty, so that they actually really have to go out of their way to cultivate it. But the catch is that might mean that they need to racialize themselves, and they may have sort of a fundamental normative objection to doing that. And so you just have to acknowledge that there are going to be some people who, you know, will never warm up to you if you're not going to sort of cater to that expectation.
Do you think those perceived sort of higher ambitions can actually be an asset to someone like a mayor who, you know, if people sort of sense he's on the rise, may sort of want to, you know, help him out because maybe that will help them down the line?
I mean, there are a certain type of people who can benefit from that. So, I mean, if you've got the types of skills where you could work for that person as they make their rise, then that's okay. But, I mean, if you're a normal workaday person, then that may not benefit you. So it's a question of whether or not you see it's in your interest to have a mayor who has a national cachet who can bring resources back to your community. But if you don't think that that mayor is bringing resources back to your community, or that the things that are coming to your community don't benefit you, then you're probably going to be more likely to resist and oppose.
Well, a prime example is Mark Zuckerberg and his $100 million donation to the public schools. Just, I don't even know if I really have a question there, but like, what is the response to this just unbelievable gift and from the people of Newark? And I guess I just don't understand how anyone could be sort of opposed to such effective attracting of investment.
So the gift came as I was sort of wrapping up the analysis of the book. So I made a conscious decision that I would actually still be writing this book if I were trying to talk about Mark Zuckerberg. So I didn't study it in depth. So there haven't been objections to the $100 million gift, but there have been questions about oversight. So there are people who aren't quite sure how the money is being used, and they want greater information. And so they've been a thorn in the side of the Booker administration, at least in terms of trying to make sure that they see that happen. You know, I think, you know, the long-term impact of that gift remains to be seen. I mean, we're still, you know, a little less than 2 years kind of into the announcement of that gift. And so, you know, that's something for another book. So, you know, it's something that I'll look at later.
That's an excellent point. Well, I guess another part, and we were having this discussion before you came as well, Booker's on a whole nother level in terms of national identity. And when we were saying, how about Newark has so many problems, it's massive. What would be your take, ideology, if he were to be able to come to Trent and be the mayor here? Because it's so much smaller, but it's almost like the problems are still the same. What would be your take on that?
That's interesting. You know, he may have experienced some of the same challenges.
Okay.
So, you know, in terms of, you know, having the community warm up to him and having to kind of, you know, prove his bona fides. You know, on the same level, the fact that it's a smaller city might make, you know, some scalar issues that actually might make it easier to sort of be able to improve the community. And given those connections, you know, if those connections were poured into a smaller city, you might actually see an impact sooner than you would, you know, in a city the size of Newark.
Yeah, and then giving thought to him here with the governor being right here. I mean, that could be because they seem to have a connection already based off, you know, Booker's national appeal and his intellect and the way he handles himself and his charisma and charm. that would be profound for Trenton. Which again, I think the only people who don't know where the capital is us.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we were just giving thought to that.
Well, I mean, so the interesting thing about Booker's relationship with Chris Christie, sometimes Booker has struggled with being labeled a Republican.
Okay.
So even though Newark is a one-party town and elections are technically nonpartisan, these folks are, rabidly Democratic, and they're very supportive of that. And so, you want to make yourself of the people and sort of fit in with the community. And so one of the ways that Sharp James was actually very successful in maligning Booker was labeling him a Republican. And he did so on the basis of his support for school vouchers and school choice and charter schools. And that actually undergirds some of the objections to Booker. Booker is not like us. He is different from us. And so in Newark, sometimes his relationship with Chris Christie is used as further evidence of that frame that Sharp James invoked 10 years ago to say that Booker is different. And so the fact that Republicans actually embraced Booker in the Meet the Press fiasco is also sort of further evidence of people who were suspicious of Booker because they didn't think that he was like them or that his interests aligned with their interests. So, in many instances, his relationship with Chris Christie, while effective for perhaps being able to get certain types of goods and resources and concessions from the state, also makes it very difficult in being able to establish a comfort level with his constituents at this time.
Okay. Now, I guess my last question would be, what do you think his next move is? There's a lot of thoughts going into, will he run again in Newark? I think he's kind of,
he's recently hinted that he's opened the door to allow for that to happen.
Okay.
He did it actually in 2010 after the $100 million Zuckerberg gift by saying that it actually may take a third term for him to actually realize the changes that he wants to see in education. I mean, I think it has a lot to do, with the fact that, the state was going to have to cede control of schools back to local control in order to make those things happen. And so he opened the door in 2010 for that to be able to happen, but he's more recently opened the door by hinting that he's keeping all of his options open. So, people thought about the third term, people thought about him running for governor next year, and people have thought about him running for U.S. Senate. In 2014 or whenever Frank Lautenberg retires. And so, he has a federal PAC that's, open. And so he can, has the ability to establish a national profile and run for the Senate if he so chooses. I think I think there are lots of things that have to be factored into that decision. So the first thing is, what do other Democrats in the state want to do? And so there are other prominent Democratic politicians in the state who are also considering statewide runs. And so, you don't necessarily want to enter the race with the crowded Democratic field. And then it's also a consideration of, challenging, Republicans at this time around. So Booker has not faced, a white challenger, and he hasn't faced a Republican challenger. And especially if he were to run against somebody like Chris Christie, we have to take into account that this guy has a national profile too. He has a huge following, and he's very aggressive. And so, Sharp James was, very challenging for somebody who's at the beginning of their political career. But Chris Christie could be equally or more challenging, and that may be something that Booker doesn't want to do. And similarly, if he's vying for the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate, if it's a crowded field, he's also going to have to go against very well-established Democrats in the state. And that's going to be a very, very different proposition than running against Sharp James or, to a lesser degree, Ron Rice Sr. or Cliff Minor. I mean, those are very, very different races than anything he's going to experience at the next level. So I think he's going to, count the cost and decide what's the best decision, for him to do.
I'm sort of curious. Do you think we'll be able to sort of read the tea leaves by how he positions himself? You would think if he were to move in this term further to the mainstream, it would suggest a run for the senator position or the governorship. And if we were moved to a more racialized position, it would seem to suggest another
term in office. Yeah, I mean, well, personally, and I've known Booker for 10 years now at this point, a racialized Booker, I think, is highly unlikely just on principle. That's just not his personality. And so he would have to, if he were to do it, he would have to do it in a way that would look authentic, because otherwise it just looks like he's being phony and pandering. And so I think personally, he's very committed to being mainstream, and he's actually very personally committed to being cross-cultural and multicultural. So the idea of a racialized Cory Booker at this point would probably strike many people as weird and inauthentic. So, I mean, if he did it, I would say, yeah, he probably is, mulling over a third term as mayor of Newark. And so the idea of him mainstreaming himself, I mean, I think he's pretty well mainstreamed. And so I think the question becomes, what is his take on economic issues going to be at this particular point? So I wouldn't expect any more defenses of Bain Capital, at least during this election cycle anymore. I think he's learned his lesson from that. I think you'll have to watch what other people do. I'm particularly interested personally in what Steve Sweeney is going to do.
Okay.
So, I don't know if Booker would run against Sweeney, for the Democratic nomination for governor or for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. And so he may actually try to wait for a more open time, which might actually portend a third mayoral run while he waits for the field to kind of thin itself out.
I guess my last question is, and you alluded to it, you spent 10 years closely following Cory Booker. You must have got to know him on a personal level fairly well. What's just your impression of Cory Booker, the guy?
Oh, I like Cory a lot. He's a great guy. So, I spent a lot of time in Newark. There were lots of people I spent more time with in Newark and got to develop really, really close relationships with. And so, I don't have that type of relationship with Cory that I have with other people like Councilman Ron Rice, for instance, who I spend a lot of time in his board, and I'm really close with him and his staff. But I think Cory, is a really nice guy. He's been very gracious to me. Over the course of the last decade, I've actually grown very, very close with his parents, and I'm quite fond of them. And they're getting ready to move back up here, but they live 20 minutes away from me in Atlanta, and so I often invite myself over to their house for food.
Have they read the book?
Yes, yeah, Mrs. Booker's read the book. So it's been really great to kind of get to know their family. There are little funny things like now when my friends have babies, I make baby blankets for them. And so the first baby blanket that I made was actually for Cory's niece.
Oh, nice.
And so it actually started sort of this nice habit of mine, except when 5 of my friends get pregnant at the same time, then I'm like, oh my goodness, how many of these do I have to do?
You're getting in for more than you bargained.
Yeah. So, it works out. And it's actually great relaxation if people have seen me at events in Newark where I have my crocheting with me and I'm, making stuff. So, it ends up working out very well. So, I feel like Newark is my second home and that Newark has become my family as a result of doing this work. So, I'll be forever grateful to Cory for that.
What was your reaction to the this recent story with Cory Booker in the burning house?
I wasn't surprised. Yeah. It was funny. I was on my way to a conference in Chicago, and so when I got off of the plane in Chicago, that was when the email started to come in. So everybody was asking me about it. My reaction to it was no different than the reaction to Cory Booker getting tweets about where to shovel snow. He is the type of person that has boundless energy and wants to help. And so I wasn't surprised at all that he would help somebody. And so, I wasn't surprised by it at all. I was very glad that he was able to, help save somebody's life. And for those who criticize, this act, I have to say that, if my house were burning and somebody needed to save me, I'm glad that somebody stepped up and decided to do that.
I guess closing out, my last question would be, what from your perspective would be something he needs to work on moving forward as mayor of Newark? Because there's always going to be naysayers and always people opinionated in regards to what could or could not be better. What would you say would be one thing he would need to work on if he were to take another term and take Newark to the next level?
This is going to sound counterintuitive. I would actually, since there are a lot of criticisms about Booker and especially about his ambition. And so there are a lot of people who charge that they don't see him enough.
Okay.
And, people need to understand that when you're a mayor of a town, you do actually need to leave to bring business to the community and have meetings and do those other things. So to say that, Cory's always hanging out with Oprah Winfrey, that's not fair and that's not true. But I think it would help to be more present in the community and to really engage citizens more on a personal level. And it's not because I don't think that, Cory isn't doing that or that he doesn't think that he's doing it. But if people are constantly making that claim, then it would just actually help to allay those concerns by being responsive to it. So, I'm not casting judgment as to whether or not I think, he's there or not there enough. But since I hear that constantly from citizens in the community, then, I think the best thing to do would be to accommodate that.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Dr. Andra Gillespie, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for coming to our studio.
Thank you.
You've been watching the Trentonian interview sessions. I'm Nick Peruffo. This is Darren Freedom Green. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Have a great day.